3 years. That's how long Ukraine has been fighting off Russia's brutal invasion. But February 24, 2025 isn't just an anniversary, it was a turning point. With US President Donald Trump back in office, the world is watching to see what happens next. Will the US continue to back Ukraine? Or is Europe about to be left to stand against Russia alone? One thing's for sure, Europe isn't waiting to find out. The continent is preparing for the worst, and the message is clear. If Russia wants a fight, Europe is ready. So what's the plan? How does Europe intend to counter the Russian threat? And what happens if the US steps back? Let's start with the historic meeting in Kyiv, where Europe's leaders made one thing certain: they're not backing down. The scene in Kyiv on the third anniversary of the invasion was nothing short of electric. 13 of the most powerful Western leaders gathered in the Ukrainian capital to send a bold message. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed them with open arms. There was no sign of President Trump, but his shadow loomed large. You could feel it in the air as European leaders subtly rebuked the rhetoric coming out of Washington and doubled down on their commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. Among the guests were heavyweights like Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission. Trudeau even took a clear jab at Trump by calling Zelensky a duly elected democratic leader. He was of course referencing Trump's shocking Truth social media post in which he labeled the Ukrainian president a dictator without elections. Despite these words, leaders from Spain, Latvia, Estonia and Finland, all nations that know the cost of Russian aggression, stood shoulder to shoulder with Zelensky. And let's not forget about the 24 leaders who joined virtually, sending a powerful message to the world: Europe will always find a way to come together. Its unity is a force that surpasses borders, both literal and digital. But this meeting was no symbolic gesture. The West came ready to act. Zelensky's call for a strong security guarantee was met with swift action. A whopping $21 billion could be on the table for Ukraine's next aid package. A lifeline for a nation under siege. European foreign ministers meeting in Brussels just hours before were already hashing out the details. Throw a fresh round of sanctions targeting Russian energy, trade, transport, and financial services into the mix, and one thing becomes clear: Europe isn't going to let Russia operate with impunity, and this is just the beginning. On March 6th, 27 European leaders will meet again in Brussels for an emergency summit with one focus: securing the future of Ukraine and Europe. European Council President Antonio Costa said it best: "We are living in a defining moment for Ukraine and European security. For Europe, the time to act is now." With leaders from every corner of the continent coming together, Russia's playbook of aggression is facing an unbreakable front, and this time, there's no room for retreat, only forward momentum. But what exactly is Europe up against? Let's first quantify the Russian threat before diving into how Europe plans to dismantle it. Now, one look at daily reports coming from the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces could easily have you believing that Russia was no longer a serious threat. Just take a look at the February 25, 2025 report detailing the losses in 3 years of the invasion. In 3 years, Russia lost 869,530 troops in Ukraine. This staggering figure includes killed, wounded, missing, and captured soldiers. If we're talking fatalities only, around 165,000 Russian troops have been killed since the launch of the invasion, according to independent Russian media outlets Meduza and Mediazona. The situation with equipment losses is equally dire. Here's an overview done by the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. In 3 years, Russia reportedly lost 10,182 tanks, 21,168 armored fighting vehicles, 38,582 vehicles and fuel tanks, 23,652 artillery systems, 1,299 multiple launch rocket systems, 1,083 air defense systems, 370 airplanes, 331 helicopters, 26,767 drones, 28 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. That's more firepower than some countries even have in their entire military arsenal. But these losses also make you wonder, why is Europe even afraid of Russia? The country seems to be on a downward spiral that's almost impossible to stop. Well, that's just the thing. The key word here is almost. Time and time again, Russia has shown a remarkable ability to absorb staggering losses and keep pushing forward. This is what's happening now, too. Despite all the losses, Russia isn't backing down. In fact, it's building up its forces at an alarming rate. You see, Russia invaded Ukraine with 169,000 to 190,000 troops in 2022. By the end of 2024, the Russian military presence in Ukraine ballooned to an impressive 700,000 soldiers. That's roughly 4 times the size of the entire military force Russia had on the border before the war even began. And it's not just about troops. Russia is also ramping up its defense production like a war machine in overdrive. In 2024 alone, the country produced and refurbished 1,550 tanks, 5,700 armored vehicles, and 450 artillery pieces. That's an increase of up to 220% in tank production and 150% in armored vehicles compared to 2022. Russia is also churning out long-range loitering munitions at a staggering pace, with a 435% increase in production of Lancet drones, designed to strike from over 30 miles away. These drones once relied on Iranian support. Now they're a key part of Russia's domestic arsenal, and their numbers are only growing. The same goes for the number of attacks. In May 2024 alone, Russia launched over 300 Lancet attacks, nearly doubling the previous month's total. With more troops, more advanced weaponry, and a relentless drive to recover from its losses, Russia is showing the world that its appetite for aggression is far from satisfied. It's clear that Russia's President Vladimir Putin isn't just after Ukraine. He has a thirst for dominance that won't stop until Europe is under his thumb. And this brings us to why Europe is consolidating its forces so urgently. The continent isn't just preparing to defend Ukraine, it's gearing up for a Europe versus Russia confrontation. And this confrontation isn't some hypothetical scenario, it's a very real possibility that's growing more imminent by the day. In fact, Russia could be ready to launch an all-out attack on Europe within 5 years, according to a report by Denmark's Defense Intelligence Service, DDIS. The report singled out the US involvement as a key factor in this timeline. If Washington goes through with pulling back its support, this will surely embolden Russia. If Russia assesses the US cannot or will not support the European NATO countries, the report warns, Russia is likely to be more willing to use military force. This means that the clock is ticking. But European leaders are already preparing for this reality. That's because assessments from NATO, Germany, Poland, Denmark, and the Baltic states all point to a similar timeline, with Russia potentially being ready to strike within 3 to 10 years. Though we're lucky if Russia even waits for that long. The Zapad 2025 military exercises, set to take place in Belarus, could provide an early warning of Russia's true intentions. And those intentions are looking more aggressive by the day. We'll let the facts speak for themselves. Russia and Belarus are preparing for some of the largest military exercises in years, involving around 13,000 soldiers, massive amounts of military equipment, and a clear message of readiness. Zapad 2025 will showcase Russia's ability to manage large-scale military operations, even in the midst of an ongoing conflict. It's one thing to hold an exercise during peacetime, it's another to demonstrate such capabilities while also fighting a war. This sends a strong message that Russia is gearing up for more than just regional conflicts, it's preparing for a larger confrontation. The scale of these exercises is staggering. To put it into perspective, Zapad 2021, the last major iteration, saw the deployment of over 80 aircraft and more than 760 pieces of military equipment, including more than 290 tanks and 240 artillery units. Some of these exercises were held near the Polish border, which was another clear message to NATO. While the specific equipment for Zapad 2025 hasn't been fully disclosed yet, we can expect to see a similar arsenal, including advanced systems like the S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile systems, T-72B3 tanks, and Su-30 multi-role fighter jets. The truth is that these exercises could be the prelude for something far worse. Russian officials have emphasized that they are preparing for modern threats, and they've even been analyzing captured NATO equipment to identify weaknesses for future exploitation. That's a chilling sign. So what is Europe planning to do about all this? Let's break it down. First and foremost, Europe wants to continue supporting Ukraine. After all, Ukraine's experienced military is currently the most effective deterrent against a Russian attack on the European Union. The longer Ukraine holds strong, the more it buys time for Europe to fortify its defenses. That's why Europe must also be prepared to fully replace the US aid if Trump does decide to pull the plug. And that's precisely what Europe plans to do: step up and pick up the slack. In reality, Europe could fully replace US aid without breaking a sweat. Since the start of the war in February 2022, the US has allocated or committed a total of roughly $180 billion to support Ukraine, and Europe's total allocations and commitments during the same period amount to about $150 billion. If we're just talking about donated military aid, the US has provided about $66.5 billion, while European nations have contributed approximately $39 billion. To match total US aid contributions, Europe would need to increase its spending by approximately 0.12% of its GDP, a very manageable amount. That's not even a blip on the radar for the EU economy. In other words, even with all the challenges that come with this, Europe has the financial means to fill the gap, especially in military spending. Sure, the real concern will be access to the US military-industrial base, since Europe doesn't produce the same cutting-edge technology and military equipment in the same quantities. But the funds are there. Europe's spending on military aid is already on par with US support, and the EU has spent $21 billion more than the US on humanitarian and financial aid combined. But what about defending the whole continent? Or at least countries that Russia is more likely to attack? Well, that's where things get a bit trickier, but it's nothing Europe can't handle. When meeting Trump for a joint press conference in Washington in late February 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron made it clear that Europe was ready to step up its defenses to build a long-lasting peace. Here's how Europe plans to defend its territories from Russia. Increasing the number of troops is the first order of business. For decades after the Cold War, European militaries shrank significantly. Many countries now only possess what NATO officials call a bonsai army, an army that's too small to fundamentally protect its own country. For example, the British Army is now at its smallest size since the Battle of Waterloo. The German Army, long underfunded, is still struggling to rebuild, needing at least 40,000 more soldiers just to reach minimum readiness. But the problem doesn't lie only in numbers. Readiness must be better too. Jim Townsend, the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, put it bluntly: European armies are too small to handle even the arms that they've got now. Without sufficient combat troops, no amount of modern weaponry will matter. And Europe needs a force equivalent to 300,000 combat-ready US troops to effectively deter Russia. Those are the current estimates. That means that building around 50 new brigades of mechanized and armored forces capable of operating in Eastern Europe's demanding battlefield conditions. Europe doesn't currently have those numbers. Even a force of 200,000 might be out of reach with current recruitment levels. So for now, Europe is aiming at a deterrent force. This force would have to be about 100,000 soldiers strong, soldiers assigned to the mission at all times, rotating in and out to maintain readiness. 100,000 is also the current number of American troops stationed in Europe, but this number is expected to fall in the coming years. This figure of 100,000 troops also matches part of NATO's rapid reinforcement strategy. The NATO force model, agreed upon in 2022, aims to make 300,000 high-readiness troops available for deployment, with 100,000 of them ready to move within 10 days. The full force should be deployable within 30 days. To reach this goal, the alliance is pre-positioning equipment and stockpiles, expanding air and missile defense systems, and integrating new members like Finland and Sweden into strategic planning. NATO has also been making moves to strengthen its eastern defenses, the side of the alliance that borders Russia. Since 2017, multinational battle groups have been deployed in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, with additional forces stationed in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That's effectively doubled NATO's presence on its eastern flank, with troops from multiple countries training and operating together. At the 2022 Madrid summit, NATO members committed to increasing these battle groups from battalion size to brigade size where needed. Latvia became the first country to make this jump in 2024, and others are expected to follow. Although Europe still has a long way to go, it's more than willing to make the journey. After all, what's the alternative? Hoping Russia never decides to attack another European country? That's not a strategy. That's wishful thinking with a side of denial. So Europe is basically hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. This also includes working on its military coordination. After all, if Europe manages to accumulate a force of 300,000, we're looking at troops coming from over 30 national armies. That's a logistical nightmare waiting to happen. It's like trying to assemble a Super Bowl winning crew using players from 30 different teams, each with their own playbook and slightly different rules of the game. If nobody's on the same page, you don't get a team, you get chaos. That's why military coordination isn't just important, it's the difference between a functional army and a bureaucratic nightmare with guns. Right now, Europe has more than 1.4 million active duty personnel spread across different national armies. The US can almost match this number on its own, but again, it's not about the numbers, it's about how well those troops work together. If Europe wants to replace the US troops in Europe successfully, it must develop tighter command structures, improve interoperability, and ensure that when those forces deploy, they function like a single, cohesive unit, not a patchwork of different national strategies. NATO's current assumption is that the Supreme Allied Commander Europe is always a top US general. But this only works when the US is leading the charge. If Trump decides to step back, Europe has to be ready to take control of its own defense without waiting for marching orders from Washington. And that's exactly why NATO's latest military exercises are more than just a show of force. They're a test run for a future where Europe can't rely on the US as its security backstop. As Steadfast Dart 2025 plays out across Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, Europe is getting a hard look at what it might mean to lead from the front, just as US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suggested. With 10,000 troops from 9 nations, live fire drills, and cyber warfare components, NATO is trying to prove that it can rapidly deploy a large-scale force without waiting for Washington's green light. Next up, military equipment and production. Europe is gearing up for a serious transformation in this area as well. History shows that when the pressure is on, market economies can deliver. Just look at West Germany under Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. It modernized its military in no time to counter Soviet forces. Now the challenge is even bigger, but so is the determination to meet it head-on. To build a credible deterrence force capable of stopping a Russian breakthrough in the Baltics, Europe needs numbers, big numbers. According to Bruegel, a respected European think tank, Europe needs at least 1,400 tanks, 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and 700 artillery pieces for this purpose. Right now, that's more firepower than France, Germany, Italy, and the UK combined. And that's before we even get to the ammunition problem. Europe needs a minimum of 1,150mm shells just to sustain 90 days of high-intensity combat. Of course, it's not just about tanks and shells. Modern warfare is about speed, intelligence, and adaptability. In practice, this means scaling up drone production to match Russia, which requires at least 2,000 long-range loitering munitions per year. It means boosting aviation, transport, missile defense, and electronic warfare capabilities. Of course, buying from the US is always an option. European arms purchases helped drive US defense exports to a record $318.7 billion in 2024. That's great for NATO cohesion, but if Europe wants true strategic autonomy, it needs to start building at home. The good news is that Europe has the industrial capacity to do this. It just needs to mobilize it. Take Germany's defense company Helsing as an example. It's already mass-producing AI-enabled drones, cranking out over 1,000 HX-2 strike drones per month. With orders from Ukraine totaling 10,000 units across 2 models, Helsing is proving that Europe's defense industry can scale up when needed. More companies following this model could bring Europe to drone parity with Russia in record time. The final aspect Europe needs is money. We've already discussed the funds Europe is pouring into Ukraine's defense, but what about its own? Currently, European NATO countries contribute around 2% of their GDP to defense. As a reminder, this is NATO's floor, not the ceiling. For Europe to seriously bolster its defenses, experts suggest that a more sustainable target will be around 3% to 3.5% of GDP. A $262 billion increase in defense spending annually is the current estimation of what Europe should aim for to fully cover its defense needs in the short term. Now, this sounds like a hefty price tag, and let's be honest, it is. However, it's also within reach. All Europe needs is a blend of national and EU-level investments. For the next 5 years, Europe should raise roughly $130 billion at the EU level. Germany alone is projected to cover at least half of that amount, increasing its overall defense spending by 3 to 4 billion euros annually over the next 15 years. A bright spot in this fiscal journey is the economic potential of defense spending. Investing in defense could significantly contribute to European economic activity. Think innovation, job creation, and industrial growth. Just take the example of large-scale production orders. Buying in bulk significantly drives down unit costs. Look at Germany's recent order of 105 Leopard 2 tanks at $3.14 billion. If Europe orders the required 1,400 tanks, prices will drop as production scales up. This could save billions in the long run. Now, we keep mentioning Germany for a reason. If it plays its cards right, this country could help fortify the entire European continent. It would ensure that nations like Poland and the Baltic states, likely Putin's next targets after Ukraine, can count on reliable support against the incoming threats. But what does playing its cards right mean in this context? Well, for starters, Germany must overcome its past inefficiencies in procurement and military readiness. It must also increase its defense spending to 3.5% of GDP and ensure its defense sector is fully equipped and prepared. Of course, this won't be an overnight fix, but Germany, like the rest of Europe, is waking up to the realization that its security depends not just on pledges, but on actionable investment. The days of pushing defense spending into the background are long gone. Europe is now heading straight for the crucial challenge ahead. The good news is that it has the money, industry, and motivation to also overcome that challenge, to outmatch anything Russia can throw at it, to defeat it once and for all. But when do you see this clash happening? If you see it happening in the first place? And do you think Europe will have enough time to fortify its defenses if the US exits the continent? While you're there, let us know whether all European NATO countries combined can eventually match the US's contribution and successfully stand against Russia. We're looking forward to reading your thoughts in the comments section below.